The night was darker than usual, the moon obscured by thick clouds that blotted out the stars. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains stood an old, decrepit cabin hidden deep in the woods. It wasn't the kind of place most people would willingly go, but for Hannah and Liam, it was supposed to be a weekend escape from the noise of the world. They were childhood friends turned college sweethearts, and the idea of spending a few quiet days in the wilderness seemed like the perfect getaway. The cabin belonged to Liam's late uncle, a recluse who had lived there until his mysterious disappearance years ago. The first day had been uneventful. They hiked through the dense forest, cooked a simple dinner, and laughed under the dim light of an old oil lamp. The cabin had no electricity or running water, but that only added to its rustic charm, or so they thought. As the night wore on, a sense of unease began to creep into the air. It started subtly, a faint scratching sound on the cabin walls, like branches brushing against the wood. Hannah dismissed it as the wind, but Liam couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Did you lock the door?" he asked as they prepared to sleep. "Yes," Hannah replied, though she couldn't remember if she had. They climbed into the creaky, old bed, the silence of the forest pressing in around them. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, Hannah woke with a start. Something had pulled her from her dreams, though she couldn't pinpoint what. She turned to Liam, who was still sound asleep, his face serene in the pale moonlight filtering through the window. That's when she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping at the front door. Her breath caught in her throat. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, and they hadn't seen another soul since they arrived. Who could be out there? "Liam," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. He stirred, groggy and annoyed. "What is it?" "Someone's at the door," she hissed. Liam sat up, listening intently. The tapping came again, louder this time. "Stay here," he said, climbing out of bed. "Don't open it," Hannah urged, fear lacing her voice. Liam grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. He peered through the small peephole, but the light outside was too dim to see anything clearly. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. No response. The tapping stopped. After a long moment of silence, Liam turned back to Hannah. "There's no one there. It's probably just a branch or something." But as he spoke, the tapping started again, this time at the window. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest. She clutched the blanket tightly as Liam shone his flashlight toward the window. "Nothing. It's just the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. They tried to go back to sleep, but the unease lingered. Every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind against the wall seemed amplified, filling the silence with tension. Around 3 a.m. the scratching started again, this time from the back of the cabin. It wasn't random like before, it was deliberate, methodical, as if someone or something was circling the cabin, testing the walls. Liam couldn't ignore it any longer. He grabbed an old hunting knife from the kitchen drawer and motioned for Hannah to stay close. "Whatever it is, it's not coming inside," he said, trying to sound confident. But just as he said that, the oil lamp flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. "Liam?" Hannah's voice was barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "I'm here," he said, gripping her hand tightly. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, moving from the back of the cabin to the front door. Then it stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind that makes your ears ring. Hannah and Liam stood frozen, their breaths shallow. Suddenly, a loud bang shattered the silence. The front door rattled violently as if something was trying to force its way in. "Run!" Liam shouted, pulling Hannah toward the back door. But as they reached the kitchen, the banging stopped, replaced by a chilling sound, a low, guttural laugh that seemed to echo from every corner of the cabin. "This isn't real," Hannah whispered, tears streaming down her face. They bolted out the back door and into the woods, the cold night air biting at their skin. Liam led the way, the flashlight bobbing wildly in his hand as they ran. Behind them, the laughter followed, growing louder, more distorted. Shadows moved in the trees, shapes that didn't belong to animals or humans. "Don't look back," Liam yelled, but Hannah couldn't resist. She turned her head and immediately regretted it. Standing in the doorway of the cabin was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by a shadow that seemed to move like smoke. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, locking onto hers. Hannah stumbled, and Liam caught her before she hit the ground. "Keep going," he urged. They ran until their lungs burned, the forest around them a blur. Finally, they emerged onto a dirt road where Liam's car was parked. They jumped in and he sped off, the tires kicking up gravel. As they drove away, Hannah glanced back one last time. In the rearview mirror, she saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, its glowing eyes following them until they disappeared into the night. They never returned to the cabin. Months later, Liam received a call from the sheriff's office. The cabin had burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. No cause was ever determined, but the locals whispered that the land was cursed, a place where things older than time itself still lingered. Hannah and Liam tried to move on, but they both knew the truth. Whatever was in that cabin hadn't been destroyed. It was still out there waiting. Emily Parker always considered herself a skeptic. Growing up in a small Midwest town, she didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of the supernatural tales her friends whispered about during sleepovers. But all of that changed when she moved into the old farmhouse on Willow Creek Road. It had been a sudden decision to rent the place. Emily was a junior at college and wanted a quieter space to focus on her studies. The farmhouse, surrounded by dense woods, seemed perfect, isolated but serene. The rent was surprisingly cheap, which Emily chalked up to its age and remote location. The landlord, a wiry old man named Mr. Harlan, had been eager to hand her the keys. Just one thing, he had said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Don't leave any doors open at night. Especially not the basement door. Emily had laughed, thinking it was some small-town superstition. Sure, Mr. Harlan, she had replied, dismissing his warning. She moved in on a chilly autumn afternoon. The house was dusty but charming, with creaky wooden floors and antique furniture. A single door led to the basement, its brass handle tarnished with age. Emily barely gave it a second glance. For the first week, everything was normal. She spent her days buried in textbooks and her nights watching Netflix, the wind outside occasionally howling against the windows. But then, strange things started happening. It began with whispers. Late one night, as Emily was finishing an essay, she heard faint murmurs coming from the basement. She paused, listening intently. The sound was soft, like someone speaking in another room. Hello, she called out, her voice echoing in the silent house. The whispers stopped. Emily shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination. But the next night, the whispers returned, louder this time. It was a low, guttural voice, speaking in a language she didn't understand. She tried to ignore it, turning up her music to drown out the sound. But deep down, unease began to creep in. One evening, as she was studying, she noticed something strange. The basement door, which she always kept closed, was slightly ajar. A chill ran down her spine. Had she forgotten to close it? She was certain she hadn't even touched the door since moving in. Hesitantly, she walked over and pushed it shut, the old hinges creaking loudly. That night, she dreamed of fire. In the dream, she was standing in the middle of a vast desert. The air was thick with heat, and the sky was an angry shade of red. In the distance, she saw a figure cloaked in black, its face obscured by shadows. It stood motionless, staring at her with eyes that burned like embers. Emily, it whispered, its voice echoing in her head. She woke up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. The whispers were no longer confined to the basement. They were in her dreams. Determined to put an end to the strange occurrences, Emily decided to investigate. She spent hours researching online, typing keywords like whispers in the basement and strange voices. Most results were useless. Paranormal forums filled with urban legends and ghost stories. But one post caught her attention. It was from a user named Jinn Seeker, who claimed to be an expert on ancient supernatural entities. The post described beings called Jinn, spirits from Middle Eastern folklore that existed in a realm parallel to humans. Some were benevolent, while others were malevolent, drawn to places of neglect or despair. Emily's blood ran cold as she read further. Jinn are known to target those who unknowingly disturb their space, the post said. They communicate through whispers, invade dreams, and thrive in darkness. The basement. Her mind raced. Was the strange presence in her house a Jinn? She didn't believe in such things, but the pieces were falling into place. That night, armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread, Emily decided to confront whatever was in the basement. She opened the door, the creaking sound echoing through the house. The air was heavy, as if the basement was holding its breath. Hello, she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She descended the stairs slowly, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was cold, colder than it should have been. Boxes were stacked against the walls and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. As she reached the bottom, the whispers began again. Emily? She froze, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The voice was coming from the far corner of the basement, where a large, dusty mirror leaned against the wall. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers. Instead, the cloaked figure from her dream stared back at her, its burning eyes locking onto hers. Leave, it hissed, its voice filled with malice. Emily screamed, stumbling backward. The flashlight slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor, plunging the basement into darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, suffocating her. Somehow she managed to find the stairs and scramble back up. She slammed the basement door shut and locked it, her chest heaving with fear. But it wasn't over. Over the next few days, the whispers followed her everywhere. At night, she felt a heavy presence in her room watching her. Objects in the house began to move on their own. Lights flickered and the temperature dropped unnaturally low. Desperate, Emily contacted Jinn Seeker, explaining her situation. The reply came quickly: "You've disturbed it. Burn sage, recite protective prayers, and leave the house immediately. Do not challenge it further." Emily didn't need to be told twice. She packed her things and left that same night, never looking back. The farmhouse remained vacant, its secrets locked away. But locals say that on quiet nights, you can still hear whispers coming from the basement, calling for the girl who dared to disturb the Jinn. The jungle was alive, teeming with the sounds of nature. The chatter of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant hoots of unseen owls. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept in, the once vibrant sounds grew quieter, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. In the middle of this vast, shadowy wilderness, two babies sat together on a patch of moss. Arya, barely 2 years old, held her little brother, Kabir, in her chubby arms. Kabir was only 9 months old, his wide, innocent eyes darting around at the unfamiliar shapes and shadows surrounding them. How they ended up there was a mystery. Earlier that day, their parents had been hiking through the forest with them. It was supposed to be a short trip, a family outing to enjoy the serenity of nature. But something went wrong. Their parents disappeared, seemingly swallowed by the jungle, leaving Arya and Kabir alone. Now, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Arya whimpered softly, clutching Kabir tighter. Her small mind didn't understand what had happened or where her parents had gone, but she knew one thing: they were alone, and the jungle felt different now that night had fallen. Kabir began to fuss, his tiny fists batting at the air. Arya patted his back the way her mother always did, humming a tuneless lullaby to calm him. It worked for a moment, and Kabir rested his head against her shoulder. Then came the sound. It started as a faint cry, barely audible over the rustling leaves. It wasn't Kabir, he was quiet now. Arya tilted her head, listening. The cry grew louder, echoing through the trees. It sounded like another baby. "Mama?" Arya mumbled, her tiny voice trembling. She waited, but there was no reply, just the persistent wail coming from deeper in the jungle. Despite her fear, Arya felt a strange pull toward the sound, as if it were calling to her. Kabir squirmed in her arms, sensing her unease. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, Arya thought it was over. But then the sound returned, closer this time. It wasn't just a cry now, it was a mix of sobbing and laughter, the kind that didn't sound quite right. The shadows around them seemed to shift, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. Arya looked around, her heart pounding. She didn't know much about the world, but even she could sense something was wrong. Kabir started crying, his wails blending with the eerie sounds of the jungle. Arya tried to hush him, but her own fear made it impossible. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was small, about the size of a toddler, but its features were distorted. Its limbs were too long, its eyes too wide, glowing faintly in the dim light. It moved unnaturally, its head tilting from side to side as it approached. Arya froze, clutching Kabir so tightly that he stopped crying, sensing her terror. The figure stopped a few feet away, staring at them with those glowing eyes. Then it smiled, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. "Play?" it asked, its voice high-pitched and sing-song like a child's. Arya shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was wrong, too sweet, too eager. The creature took another step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Arya scrambled backward, dragging Kabir with her. "Stay away," she cried, her voice cracking. The creature paused, tilting its head as if considering her words. Then it opened its mouth and let out a scream so loud and piercing that Arya covered her ears, Kabir wailing in fear. The jungle came alive around them. Shadows moved on their own, circling the children. Strange whispers filled the air, voices speaking in a language Arya couldn't understand. Desperate to escape, Arya got to her feet, stumbling as she held Kabir. She ran, her tiny legs carrying her as fast as they could through the dense undergrowth. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step. The creature's laughter echoed behind her, chilling and relentless. The wind howled outside as Mira cradled her baby, Arif, in her arms. Their small house stood at the edge of the forest, isolated but serene. It was an old structure built decades ago, with creaky wooden floors and windows that rattled on stormy nights. Mira had inherited it from her grandmother and moved in after Arav was born, hoping to raise him in a peaceful environment. Tonight, however, something felt different. The air was colder than usual, and a strange stillness settled over the house. Arav, usually a calm baby, had been unusually fussy all evening. He whimpered and clung to Mira's chest, his tiny fingers clutching her sweater. "Shoo, it's okay, baby," Mira whispered, rocking him gently. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up. Thunder rumbled in the distance, followed by a flash of lightning that briefly illuminated the room. As she swayed back and forth trying to soothe her son, she heard it for the first time. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Mira?" Her body stiffened. The voice was so soft that she wasn't sure if she had imagined it. She looked around the room, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. "It's just the wind," she told herself, clutching Arav tighter. The house was old after all and prone to strange noises. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Mira?" The sound sent a chill down her spine. It seemed to come from the direction of Arav's crib. Mira stared at the wooden crib across the room, its shadow stretching long and eerie in the dim light. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice rising. Arav whimpered again, his tiny face scrunching up as if he, too, sensed the unease in the room. Gathering her courage, Mira walked toward the crib, her steps hesitant. She peered into it, half expecting to see. What? She didn't know. But the crib was empty, just as it should be. Then she noticed something odd. The mobile above the crib, shaped like little animals, was spinning slowly. She hadn't wound it up. Her breath hitched. She quickly stepped back, clutching Arav. "It's just the wind," she repeated, but her voice sounded hollow even to herself. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Mira?" She turned sharply, her eyes darting around the room. The voice didn't sound angry or threatening, it was almost pleading. But it was unnatural, disembodied, and that was enough to terrify her. She grabbed her phone from the bedside table and tried to call her sister, Priya, who lived a few miles away. The phone didn't have a signal. "Of course," she muttered, cursing the remote location of the house. Suddenly, Arav started crying, his wails piercing the eerie silence. He squirmed in her arms, his tiny fists flailing. Mira tried to soothe him, but his cries only grew louder. "Shoo, baby, it's okay," she murmured, though her own fear made her voice shake. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Mira's breath quickened. She reached for the flashlight she kept on the bedside table and clicked it on, the narrow beam cutting through the dark. The whisper came again, louder and closer. "Mira?" The beam of the flashlight landed on the mirror across the room. For a split second, she thought she saw something, a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. A cold dread settled in her chest. She needed to get out of the house. Clutching Arav tightly, she grabbed a blanket from the bed and wrapped it around him. She moved toward the door, her steps hurried but cautious. As she reached for the doorknob, it rattled violently as though someone on the other side was trying to force it open. Mira froze, paralyzed with fear. "Who's there?" she cried, her voice cracking. The rattling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then from the other side of the door came a soft, guttural laugh. Raina and Callie had been inseparable since they were little. Growing up in a small, quiet town surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills, they had spent every summer exploring the woods that fringed their backyard. Those woods were a magical realm in their imaginations, full of secrets, old oaks with faces carved into their bark, and hidden trails where the sunlight shimmered like gold. But that was when they were children, when everything was fun and safe and the stories they whispered at night were nothing more than games. That summer, Raina was 16 and Callie, with her wild curls and knowing eyes, was 15. They were no longer kids, though the woods still felt like home. It was early August, the air heavy with the scent of pine and the low hum of crickets. They had ventured deep into the forest this time, further than they ever had before. The trees grew taller, their limbs forming an almost impenetrable canopy above. Shadows moved in the corners of their eyes, but neither spoke of them. They were used to the way the woods played tricks on them. "Do you remember when we used to tell stories here?" Callie said, pushing a branch out of her way as they walked. "Of course I do," Raina replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "The tales of the ghost children, the ones who wander and never grow old." Callie laughed, but it came out a little too sharp. Raina turned to look at her, her eyes squinting into the dappled light. Callie was staring at the ground, tracing patterns in the dirt with her boot. "Are you okay?" Raina asked, her voice softening. Callie looked up, her dark eyes wide, her pupils a little too large. "Yeah," she said, but her voice was brittle. "It's just, I thought I heard something." The smile vanished from Raina's face. The woods had never felt so quiet before. The usual chirping of the birds had stopped, replaced by a silence that seemed to press against her eardrums. They stood there for a moment, trying to convince themselves it was just the wind. But the wind didn't come. "Come on," Callie said, forcing a laugh that cracked like dry branches. "Let's go back." They turned, retracing their steps, but the forest seemed different now. The path they had come by was gone, swallowed by roots that had knotted together and leaves that blocked out the sky. The air was colder, as though an unseen breath had settled around them. Raina felt a prickle of fear skitter down her spine. She reached for Callie's hand, but it was already in hers, trembling. "Raina," Callie whispered. "We need to find a way out. This isn't right." Raina looked around, the woods suddenly unfamiliar. Shapes moved between the trees, shadows that shifted with too much purpose. And then she heard it, a giggle, high and childlike but distorted. It didn't come from Callie, who was holding her hand like a vice. It was from deeper in the forest, behind them. "Did you hear that?" Raina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Callie said. There was no humor in her voice now. Only fear. They started walking faster, though the forest seemed to stretch and shift with every step, the trees leaning in, their bark gnarled and twisted like old, angry faces. The giggle came again a few feet behind them. And then, the faint sound of a child calling out, but it was distorted, a whisper barely audible over the rush of their own breaths. "Help, come play." The air grew colder, and a thin fog crept between the trees, curling around their ankles like the fingers of some unseen creature. Callie stumbled, but Raina caught her. The moment their eyes met, Callie's expression changed from fear to something else. Something deeper and darker. Raina couldn't name it, but it made her blood run cold. "Raina, we need to leave. Now." Before Raina could respond, the giggle erupted again, louder, closer, almost in their ears. And then a voice, small and trembling, said, "Raina? Callie? Is that you?" The voice was unmistakable. It was Leah, Raina's little sister. She had disappeared 2 weeks ago, vanished without a trace from their home in the middle of the night. They'd searched the entire town and the woods for her, but there had been no sign. Until now. Raina turned, her heart hammering in her chest. "Leah?" Her voice broke as she called out, half hope, half terror. A figure stepped out from behind a tree. It was Leah, but not as Raina remembered. Her hair was matted and tangled, her clothes torn and dirt-streaked. Her eyes were wide, and when she spoke, the voice that emerged was hollow, like the wind itself. "Come with me," Leah said, and reached out a hand that trembled in the air between them. "Leah, I'm here," Raina cried, taking a step forward. But the forest seemed to grow darker, the trees tightening in around them. A sudden rustle behind them made Callie scream, and Raina spun around just in time to see the shadow moving toward them. It was not human. It had limbs too long and thin, with fingers that ended in claws. Its face was obscured, but its body pulsed with an unnatural, sickly light. The smell of rot and something metallic filled the air, making Raina gag. "Run!" Callie screamed, and this time Raina didn't hesitate. They turned and ran, weaving through the underbrush, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed alive, its roots trying to snag their feet, branches reaching out like grasping hands. Behind them, the sound of footsteps that were not their own echoed, heavy and quick. The figure was relentless, closing in with every step. And then, suddenly, they broke through the tree line, stumbling into the clearing where the moon hung low in the sky, casting silver light over the tangled forest floor. The clearing was silent, the unnatural noises of the woods stilled as if a spell had been cast. Raina turned to look behind her, but there was no sign of the creature, only the shifting branches and the dark shadows of the forest. "We need to get out of here," Callie panted, grabbing Raina's arm. But when Raina turned to look at her, Callie's eyes were wide, filled with terror and something else. A glimmer of understanding, a recognition that made Raina's stomach clench. "Callie, what's wrong?" Raina whispered. Callie's gaze flickered over Raina's shoulder, and then she gasped. "Raina, look out!" Before Raina could react, a shadow fell over her, and she was pulled backward into the dark.